Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us this morning. And we are continuing on our study through the Daodejing. We are currently in chapter 47. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. Without going out the door, know the world. Without peeping through the window, see heaven's Tao. The further you travel, the less you know. I'm just going to pause here for just a second. So for some of you who know me a little bit better, you might be aware of the fact that I don't actually like to travel. I pretty much would stay home all the time if other things weren't like dragging me out to go other places. And so I always kind of thought of this chapter as a little bit of a vindication for all the homebodies that don't like to go out traveling. But that's not exactly what this chapter is about. But what we can see here, and maybe I'll just back up to the first couple of verses real quick. Without going out the door, know the world. Without peeping through the window, see heaven's Tao. And then again, the further you travel, the less you know. So and from there, let me just do the tail end here. It's kind of a short little chapter. This is why the sage knows without budging, identifies without looking, and does without trying. Any initial thoughts on what this chapter is trying to get at?
I mean, this is saying look inside for guidance. Don't be too heavily influenced with what's going on externally.
Okay. So would you say like that's more of kind of like fine-tuning your intuition, or what is looking internal versus external? How do you see that?
Like it says, without going out the door, know the world. So, like, to put it simply, be yourself. Like, rely on your own intuition, and like trust in following it, I guess.
Maybe like when they say let your conscience be your guide type of a thing.
Yeah. Like, don't let other people's conscience be your guide.
Kind of a side note, what's kind of interesting about that word is it's really morphed over time. Whereas currently we think of it as that little voice inside our head that's telling us what to do. Initially, the word means shared knowledge of yourself. So it was an external thing. It was what is the collective community's understanding about you was actually your conscience. It's kind of an interesting transition.
Interesting.
Anybody else have some thoughts about this chapter?
In the Vipassana training, which is supposedly the original meditation technique discovered and taught by the Buddha himself, they teach that the focus of the meditation is on your own sense perceptions, because that is the ultimate reality.
So your sense perceptions are the ultimate reality. Does that mean, and I'm not as familiar with as in depth with Buddhism, but are they saying that there is not a world beyond the senses, or is it saying that we have accurate access to the world through our senses, or what is the idea of the senses are the ultimate reality?
Well, I would consider both of those statements to be philosophical extrapolations. But I think you could say that Buddhism is a is an ascending philosophy in the sense that the well, the way I would put it is that your own, if you want to know what is true and real, just go to your own sense perceptions. That is what is true and real.
Okay, so they would have
like that's kind of by itself. You could extrapolate beyond that that there is no physical reality, or that we have direct experience of physical reality, but uh that it's, I mean, in the context of the meditation technique, it's like this is what the Buddha did, this is what the Buddha taught to do, is just focus on your own sense perceptions, and that is the gateway to the true experience of reality. That is the one and only true experience of reality, is exactly what you are perceiving in the moment. That is quote unquote reality. The fundamental base reality.
Yeah, so ultimately we don't have any choice but to experience through our sense perceptions, right? I mean, that is our only way of perceiving anything. So I get that. How are they concerned with illusion or false perception?
Well, again, in the context of like training the meditation technique, it's not a philosophy class, you're learning a meditation technique, but in the context of learning that technique, the basically, I guess you could say the purpose of it is to learn how to directly perceive your own sense perceptions without allowing the mind to cloud that process. So instead of perceiving what's like in your mind, you're directly perceiving whatever your senses are displaying.
Gotcha. So it's trying to move past the interpretation of the sense data and just get to the sense data itself.
I'd say, yeah, that's probably accurate.
Okay.
The direct perception, or yeah, direct interface with the perception rather than the interpretations and all that.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, we definitely have
And
seen.
supposedly that's what the Buddha did, that caused him to become enlightened. That's the story.
Nice.
Just pay attention to your body sensations, and that is the gateway to ultimate reality.
Well, we've definitely seen some similar parallels within the Daodejing, where there's this concern about how do we get past our culturally constructed ways of looking at the world, which would be those interpretations. How do we get past that to see more clearly what is, as opposed to what should be or what we want? So yeah, I could see some interesting overlap there.
I'll just share one thing I experienced doing this. Was the first day or two, maybe, you spend about 6 or 8 hours a day in seated meditation. And basically it's designed so you learn what it's like to live as a monk. And the first day or two, when I was sitting, I would be counting my breaths, because you're supposed to focus on your breath. And I would count them, and I noticed when I'd count to 100 a certain number of times, and then an hour would go by. And I found that made it kind of easier to sit there and be still. But then the next day, the teacher said, "Oh, you're not supposed to count. You're not supposed to think anything in your mind." And I was like, "Oh, I guess that's cheating." And I found that when I wasn't counting, it was more challenging to just sit and be in the sensation, because there's nothing to keep my mind occupied. But that's an example of, like, if you're counting or doing something with your mind, that's kind of coming as a filter between you and direct sensory perception.
That sounds very challenging.
You're not supposed to think anything. Sit still and think about nothing.
It's like playing golf. No thoughts. Just hit. Just hit the ball. No thoughts.
Let's kind of start to break this down a little bit. I want to come back to where the translation is using this word identifies, It's coming from the Chinese character of Ming, which has to do with name or naming. So you might recall the opening of the Daodejing starts off by saying that the Tao that can be Taoed is not the constant Tao. And then it follows that up by saying the name that can be named is not the constant name. So naming is definitely a theme that is central within Taoist thinking and actually within classical Chinese philosophy as a whole. And part of the reason this takes on the level of importance that it does is that when we name something, we are enabling a way for us to have kind of a shared experience about something. One of the things that language does is that it becomes kind of a shared interface between people in which we can communicate ideas. Without words, it becomes a lot more complicated in terms of and limited in terms of what we can actually communicate to someone else. But when we introduce language, now we have a much fuller way of being able to explain and talk about essentially what we're perceiving internally, right? It's a way to have an external interface to what's happening internally. So I can share with you something about what I'm thinking, which you would not be able to perceive otherwise. And it gives that gateway then for this communication to happen. What's interesting about it, though, is the definitions of names can be confused, where I might have a certain way of thinking about a name and you have a different way of thinking about that same name. And that's then going to create actually confusion in the communication or provide a miscommunication. So one of the big concerns that they have is around this idea of rectifying names or making sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of what certain words mean. The other concern that the Taoists have is there's a bit of a misperception that we can have simply by giving something a name. It can appear that if we're talking about, this cup versus the table or something like that, that then we're talking about actually separate things. And they would see this as useful in terms of how we navigate our world, but it's also problematic in the sense that it gives a false sense of separateness, that things are actually separate from each other. So this is kind of a key part of this passage, that the sage then is able to correctly identify or correctly name without looking. And that's kind of curious. How does that happen without looking? And the same thing seems to be happening above here. And we'll go back over the opening part of this passage. But here it's saying at the top of this page that the sage knows without budging, again, without traveling, without going anywhere. And the final part does without trying. This is, you might think, referring back to the idea of wu wei, of non-action, but this is actually bu wei, which is without action, but not non-action. It's a slightly different way of saying, that they're not actually trying to do something, but yet it's happening. And this is, if we think about the overall context of Taoism being concerned about these patterns that essentially govern how everything works, there's this phrase that comes up repeatedly, that the Tao, without doing anything, even though the Tao doesn't do anything, everything is done. Nothing is left undone. There's kind of the sense that everything's going to unfold the way that it's supposed to unfold. And this kind of ties back into how we might think more in terms of like determinism, that there's these physical laws or properties that unfold in a certain way, and they're going to happen even if nobody actually intervenes. That doesn't require anybody to intervene. It just unfolds the way that things unfold. So we have here the sage also tapping into this way of being that allows things to unfold in the way that they're going to unfold. And so we have this idea of doing or does without trying. But the other part here about the knowing and identifying without actually going out, I think is really curious. And if we back up to the opening part, then we can see that this idea of knowing is really central to this passage, because it's talking about this concept of knowing frequently. So this can be understood in a couple of different ways, either as an understanding about how something works, but it can also relate to this idea of mastery, of knowing how to do something. So without going out, then there's this idea that something can be known or mastered about the world. And the same thing in terms of here it's talking about heaven's Tao. When you think about the distinction between heaven and earth, or how these things are related, in addition to talking about the totality of everything, they're also kind of split between the yin and the yang concept of that duality, or those poles. And heaven is sometimes seen as controlling, in the sense that you have the movements of things like the sun and the moon, as well as the stars, that seem to affect the things on earth in terms of day and night, but also the seasons and so forth. So there's a correlation there, where often heaven then is seen as the yang, the thing that is acting, it's got the brightness, and the earth is the yin, and that it is more passive, and it's responding to the things that are happening in the heaven, and how it brings about the different conditions that we experience. And if you think about a agricultural community, of course, being able to understand the timing of the seasons, as well as the days, and how to go about things like planting and harvesting and so forth, there's a great deal of concern about having that kind of knowledge about how the patterns of the world work. So this heavens Tao is a key component to what they need to understand, the heavens way. And the suggestion is that these things are being able to be understood in some sense, without, as it says, traveling. The further you travel, or the further you go, it's suggesting the less that you know. And then we saw the end here we just talked about. So at a fundamental level, what this chapter is starting to address is the question of epistemology in more modern day sense. And epistemology is the question of, how do we know what we know? How do you learn? What is the nature of knowledge? And this is, I think, a fascinating topic. And I think that in the Daodejing, we're seeing a very interesting way of thinking about what constitutes as knowledge, or how do we know something. So to jump into this a little bit, then, what is really unique about their perspective on knowledge is first and foremost that they have this interconnected and relational way of looking at the world. So when we talk about the oneness idea, we have the concept that essentially everything is one thing. Now, this doesn't mean that that one thing is exactly one thing. It could be, like one system or one way that things happen. If we think about it in, again, more modern terms, we could say that everything, for example, is made up of atoms, right? Just in different configurations. But we can also say those atoms are made up of particles, and we get down to a smaller subset of things. And then we could say, well, actually, those particles are maybe agitations within a quantum field or something to that effect. And so we get closer and closer to this idea of a oneness, even though we wouldn't say that there's technically only one thing. The idea that there's this oneness idea of that being the source of everything, but just in different configurations, is not too far removed from our modern physics way of understanding what the nature of reality is. We would say that ultimately we've got, a handful of particles or things within quantum fields and a handful of forces that in combination end up producing everything that we experience. Of course, there's still a lot of questions about things that are very far away and things that are very, very small, that we're still obviously working on. We don't have a complete picture of physics and how everything works in the universe, but we do have enough of an idea that we can see that there's an underlying component that makes up everything that we experience and that we interact with. Somehow they came up with a very similar understanding of this oneness in classical Chinese philosophy that led to a way of thinking about the world that is fundamentally interconnected and relational. So by that, we're saying we can't think about what is a person without addressing all the other elements that are required for a person to actually exist. And the same thing with all the different types of attributes, those seem to exist in relation to those other things. So we'll break down a couple of components of this. One is that everything is perspectival in the sense that there is no view from the outside, right? We might talk about like a God's eye view or something like that. Everything is a perspective from a particular place. So the subjective experience that we have of being here versus there, and that as a consequence of being here versus there, we are going to see a subset and only ever a subset based on our perspective. And there's no way to get around that. We don't have an ability to be outside of everything because we are a part of of the whole, right? We are inside. There's only a view from the inside, and our particular views are always going to be from a particular perspective. We don't have the ability to see everything, but only a certain vantage point. Just want to make sure I'm not going too far ahead here for a second. So do we kind of grasp this idea of everything as from a particular perspective as opposed to a more general, broad, like God's eye view of things?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I think so. I think I'm keeping up. I don't think I can form any like new thoughts around it yet, but I'm following.
Okay. Yeah. So, and even in terms of like how we relate to other people or engage in conversations, this idea that everybody has a perspective and their perspective is fundamentally going to be different in the sense that, if we're facing each other, what I perceive is different than what you perceive and vice versa. Then that helps us to have a little bit of a, if we're talking about epistemology, what do we know or how do we know? Then this creates a sense of epistemological humility and a sense of realizing there's no way for me to know everything about anything. And other people are going to necessarily have some additional information about things because their perspective is coming from a different point of view, right? A different perspective. And so there's something that can be added to my understanding or knowledge of the world based on those different perspectives. And this is really a kind of a key aspect that comes into play when we're thinking about knowledge from this classical Chinese perspective, which tends to be a bit different than how we want to focus on things from a Western perspective. From a Western perspective, we're not trying to get at that subjective experience. We're trying to understand the universal or God's eye view of things, of how is everything actually, not just how is it perceived from a particular perspective. So we're already at kind of a little bit of odds with the overall way that we tend to think about things from more of a Western perspective, where we're trying to get the generalities, we're trying to understand the universal, or the view from everywhere, or the view from nowhere, where this is arguing that fundamentally we can only know the view from our particular perspective. So related to that then is this idea of codependent origination, which is kind of a long phrase, but it's very interesting. If everything at a fundamental level is relational, one of the things that we realize is that the attributes of something, if we think about how do we know something, there's different attributes about it that we come to know. So if you're trying to understand, who Jim Jones is, we might be looking at questions of, well, some basic attributes. How tall is he? What gender is he? What color is he? All these kinds of attributes we might be thinking about. How much does he weigh? But all of these only make any sense in relationship to something else. So if we want to understand height, it's always going to be in relationship to something else that's either taller or shorter. Height doesn't mean anything if there was nothing at all but a single object. You couldn't talk about anything about it. You couldn't say that it was tall or short. You couldn't say it was wide or skinny. You couldn't say it was heavy or what color it was or any of these things, because in order to have any of those attributes, it necessarily requires that it is a question of its relationship to something else. And so for all of our actual attributes that we can know about something, we only know about it in the sense that it is with something else, which means there's this kind of codependent origination of how things actually even exist. And this can go beyond just simply how would we describe something, but it can also go into how is it possible for something to actually exist. So again, if we're talking about, a person, they can't exist without being able to breathe. They can't exist without gravity holding them together. They can't exist without, the planet to hold them up, or all the other things that come into play in terms of, how do we get nutrients into our body, and all the other types of things, in terms of our symbiotic relationship with tons of other types of bacteria. How would you even begin to talk about something existing apart from all those things? You can't. And as you follow that thread for anything in our world, we realize it ultimately ties into and connects to an innumerable number of things, and a chain of cause and effect that goes all the way back. So this codependent origination is helping us to recognize that there's no way to really talk about anything except in its context, that there is, in that relationship with each other, is the actual knowing of the thing itself, that the context is part of that knowing. You can't have the knowledge apart from that context. And this is, I think, where we might get into some interesting challenges with some of our physics, trying to isolate and understand things at its smallest, most basic level. I suspect that some of our challenges in terms of like the measurement problem and some of these other things, the collapse of the wave function and so forth, is bizarre types of behavior that are a result of trying to isolate things from its context. And the types of things we have are, in terms of these strange behaviors, are a result of it still being interacting with its context. So if everything only exists in relationship to something else, is necessarily going to be affected by the presence of other things, and we can never get outside of the system because we are in the system and we are part of that same system that interacts with everything. So this is a fascinating, again, early understanding of this codependent part of existence, that things only exist in relation to other things, and that relational context is also interdependent in terms of, you can't have a person without all the stuff that's required for a person to actually exist. Everything kind of needs to be there for any of the things that we experience. I'll kind of pause after each of these because they're kind of big concepts. So are you tracking with this idea of codependent origination?
Yeah, it's weird to think about it. Like, I know we live it every day, but it's weird to think that we're all just made up of particles at the end, and that we don't just like blend in with the things that we touch. Like everything keeps its form. It's just kind of weird to think about that. But I'm following. It's making me look at things differently.
Yeah. So one of the things that we can start to see with a couple of these is how important context, location, we might say, is to the ability to know. And this is going to maybe start to shed some light on where this passage is going with that. The other thing that's going to happen when we see this interconnected, relational, interdependent relationship between everything is this idea of affordances and constraints. So affordances are things that are possible, and constraints are, of course, things that are not possible. So if we're thinking about the fact that I'm sitting here at my desk, it's not possible for me at this moment to open my car door because prior conditions, me walking over to my desk and sitting down here, has put a constraint on some things that I can do. There's things that I can do, but they're related to where am I right now? What is around me? What are, the laws of physics and the features of the different things that I'm currently interacting with. The fact that I have this computer that has a program called Zoom, and there's this thing called the internet, and there's other people out there that are using these things as well, has afforded then the possibility for us to have this conversation across the country at this particular time, right? So there's affordances that become possible because of the immediate context. If I wasn't sitting in front of my computer, I wouldn't be able to do this because that would be a constraint. So understanding the context and where we are and how these things are related to each other helps us to see a little bit more clearly what is possible in a particular context and what isn't possible. And so this is going to be another key aspect of how do we know something. Again, with this context, it helps us to see our range of affordances and constraints. The other thing is they would argue that this is always unique. In the same way you've heard that phrase, the same person can't step into the same river twice, because not only is the river always moving, but the person is also changing. And so they're never quite the same thing. Circumstances are never going to be exactly identical either. So even though we gather at a particular time on a particular day on a regular basis, there's always things that come into play that are going to be slightly different. Some people can make it, some people can't make it because maybe other events are happening, or somebody gets sick, or the power goes out because there's a snowstorm. There's always different things happening that make each situation unique. There may be similar things, but every situation is going to be fairly unique. And so part of what we are trying to understand, if we think about knowledge in terms of mastery, is that these changing circumstances mean that we don't necessarily have a global answer to how do we act. Our ability to act needs to be conditioned upon the unique circumstances of each situation. So where sometimes people get frustrated with how the Daodejing teaches, it doesn't give us like, here's the solution for how you act in every situation, because they would argue there is no universal situation where these things are always true. So we need to be a bit more adaptive in each context based on what the unique circumstances are at that moment. And so that kind of knowledge, that kind of mastery is almost more of a meta understanding that gives us a perspective that helps us to know how to act in a given situation at that time based on the specific circumstances. But it's not necessarily a general principle that you can always use everywhere. Again, really different from how we're normally thinking about things, where when we think about ethical questions or, how do we try and treat situations in business or in government, we try to come up with general universal concepts that we can always do or always use. But the struggle with those kind of global ideas is that every context is always unique. And sometimes the past way of doing something isn't going to fit well with the current way or the current needs based on the circumstances. So this is, again, a unique way of looking at this idea of knowledge, and what counts for knowledge that goes a little bit against the grain from our Western perspective. So then it gets to this final point that I want to talk about, which is that knowing then is going to be much more a result of participating in and becoming aware of how all these interdependent and interconnected relational affordances and constraints exist in wherever I am, right? It's a unique situation that needs to be understood. And if everything ultimately is interdependent and we see how it fans out into the larger and larger context of this interconnected, codependent way of existing, then we can start to see how they would talk about the ability of knowing without having to go anywhere, but also that the idea of having to go somewhere to learn something works against this. If who I am and what I am and what I can do and how I operate in my world is so dependent on my context, then trying to find that out by traveling somewhere else is actually working against my ability to perceive, because I'm changing my context. I'm walking away from the things that define what I am in that context. And this is why the quest to discover something is almost contrary to then this idea of what happens when we really dive deep into understanding how everything is related within our context. And this would be why they would say something like, the more you travel, the less you know. And it's not meant to be taken in a fully literal sense, right? There's a certain amount of hyperbole that's going on there that's just to emphasize the point that as we change our context, we're changing all these features that are going to change what we can know. So just because I go over here and I learn something, that's not necessarily going to be as helpful if I come back home, because what was relevant in that context might not be relevant in this context. So there's not the same kind of benefit that we're used to thinking of in terms of traveling to discover information to bring back. There's, again, kind of extreme positions that are being presented here. Is not to say that we can't learn anything by traveling, and certainly there are lots of things that we would learn because our context changes, and it can awaken us to things that we were unaware of in terms of our biases and whatnot, because in our own little world, we only ever experience things a certain way. There's a different way we're going to experience things in other locations. But that fundamental idea they're getting at in terms of how we learn needs to transfer to wherever we travel to. That becomes a new context in which we have to really understand in that location. It becomes harder to transfer knowledge from context to context, at least in terms of the big picture they're looking at here. Clearly, there's things we can learn from other places that we can bring back that are going to help us to develop even further. But it's this overall strategy of recognizing this interconnected and relational aspects that's at the core of how they think about knowledge. So that was kind of a fair amount of stuff there. So I'm going to pause and see if people have some thoughts on this.
It's definitely interesting.
I was going to say, after taking a break and coming after a while, I'm struggling to keep up a little bit. And I'm noticing more and more the difference between the first half of the book or the first book and the second one. The shift is so dramatical. And yeah, I'm having a very hard time with those topics.
So do you see a distinction between how we normally think about the acquisition of knowledge in our context versus how they were thinking about it in classical Chinese philosophy?
I guess I've never thought about it in a way of, this is the way we acquire knowledge. That's how I was raised. I've never had a chance to kind of describe it, I guess. And I don't necessarily know if I'm grasping the difference. Like, I can see there are some differences, but I'm not sure if I can grasp that they're different from what I have experienced so far. It's just a lot of, I'm not gonna lie, a lot of words that I'm trying to process.
Yeah. Well, maybe an interesting example, and again, this would be maybe taken to a little bit of an extreme, but it might help in terms of how we think about things. But from an ethical perspective, one of the things we might be taught as children is it's never right to lie. You always need to tell the truth. So this would be stating that there's a way of being that is universally applicable. But if we think about it in terms of from this classical Chinese perspective or this Taoist perspective, they would say, you need to weigh each situation to see if it makes sense to be truthful or how truthful in that particular context. There's not really a way that you could say that there's a universal way that you should be. And of course, one of the big challenges that people will bring up in terms of this is, and I don't know why it always goes back to this particular example, but it's frequently the one I hear.
The horse?
Well, no, I was going to say, what if you were in Nazi Germany, right? And you are harboring a Jew in your basement, and the Nazis come knock on your door and ask if you have any Jews. You know, the question is, well, if ethically you're always supposed to tell the truth, that would be problematic, right? Because it's going to not work well in that situation. And so we would say that the person is justified in not telling the truth in that context. And this would be showing where our generalities of trying to say that you always need to tell the truth clearly doesn't work, and that it needs to be much more content or context specific in terms of how you think about what the right action to do is, right? So that would be like how we can see the distinction between trying to say that there's some universal ethic or universal way of behaving or doing or knowing that is being challenged to say, well, actually, it needs to be thought about in much more of a context specific way.
Again, I see the difference, but I just don't necessarily see that I would have not necessarily didn't live it this way. I guess I just never thought about it, that I have previously, up until this point, have not thought about it in the context. I cannot say that I have, because obviously I haven't thought about how I've been living, but it's just that the delta is not as cut and clear for me personally.
And it might not be as obvious if you haven't spent as much time looking into philosophy or theology, trying to understand some of the different ways of looking at it. But there's
Or how have you lived your life in the first place? And, who analyzes their own life? Like, how have I been raised? What did my parents teach me? Especially if you have complicated relationships with them.
certainly. Anybody
I
else
think
have? Oh, go
like
ahead.
context specific learning, I think it's been talked about more recently as far as like schooling goes. Like not every kid learns the same. Like they all learn differently. And I think there are certainly things that are much easier to learn by doing. And I don't know if this is necessarily what they're talking about, but maybe just a simplified version of it. Like if you're learning to be a scientist, maybe you learn through books at first, but then like there's a certain barrier there where you can no longer learn through books. You have to put things under the microscope and really get in there and learn how to do it. Whereas if you're learning to be a writer, then really it's book based probably. So I think in acquiring knowledge, there are certainly different ways to learn, and we've kind of squished everyone into the same bucket, okay, of like, okay, everyone's going to go to school and here's the curriculum. You're going to get a book, you're going to do these chapters, you're going to take a test, and then you're going to move on. And I think we could afford to talk about how we learn a lot more so that, people who don't learn that way could certainly benefit from a different avenue.
Mhm. Yeah, there's an interesting parable that gets told. It's not the farmer and the horse this time. This one is the farmer and the hare. So the way
Same
this,
farmer?
I don't think so. But the context is a question of, from a political perspective, how they did things in the past. Is that how we should do things now? And the way the parable is told, there's this farmer and he's out in his field and he's got this tree stump out there, and there's this rabbit that just comes bounding out of nowhere and for some reason runs into this tree and breaks its neck and dies. And he's like, oh, well, this is fantastic. Basically, got my free food. It's just kind of showed up here. And so, because that would be something they would eat. So what does he do? Well, he puts down his plow and decides he's just going to sit there at that stump and just wait for the rabbits to show up. And, the consequences, well, this was really foolish because just because something worked at one point doesn't mean it's going to always be that way, right? And the context they would say is just because this might be how an emperor did it in the past doesn't mean we should do it this way now, because things can change. And looking to the past as how things should be in the present is kind of like the farmer sitting at the stump waiting for more rabbits to run into it. It just doesn't make sense. So
That's a really sad story, Jim. Can you tell it was a puppy instead of a rabbit?
We'll be killing puppies now. Oh my god.
They're better eating.
Oh my. Well, let's not devolve this story, but you get the idea. It's just kind of interesting how something might have been successful, but it was unique circumstances in which that was applicable. And to make that a universal as something that we should always do or how we always handle this situation, doesn't make sense. We need to be aware of the changing circumstances of each situation that require us to have some adaptability in terms of how we respond to each situation in its unique context. Well, this is definitely one that requires a lot of thinking. So hopefully you've got a little something to think about until next week. But we'll go ahead and bring it to a close at this point. If you've been watching this and you'd like to join us on our live Zoom conversation, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get an email with links to our Zoom discussion on Friday mornings, as well as, if you happen to be in the Southern California area, to our in-person discussion on Sunday mornings. All right, guys, I hope to see you next time. Take care.